Washington, capital of the United States, the setting for all three parts of this film. At its center, the White House. The Constitution makes the US president the most powerful man on the planet, and there is no safeguard to this superpower. The rise in number of White House staff is staggering, from 3 advisors and 3 secretaries in 1928 to 650 under Bill Clinton. During the presidency of Richard Nixon, though, this number reached the astronomical figure of 5,000. To one side, 50 meters from the White House, is the NSC, the National Security Council, which over the years has become the decision-making center of American foreign policy. On the other side, the Department of Defense, otherwise known as the Pentagon. It is a town in itself with its own subway stations and bus routes. Some 140,000 people work here. It is the heart of the American strategic forces, and from here are controlled the 302 US military bases overseas. Across town is the US State Department, which handles foreign affairs. This is the seat of American diplomacy, carrying out the policy decided upon by the President and his Secretary of State. Finally, on the outskirts of Washington, the headquarters of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, a totally impenetrable fortress. It is within this small area that the fate of the world is decided. A power structure created 50 years ago by Harry S. Truman, who from being a relative unknown became the 33rd President of the United States in April 1945.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news. President Roosevelt is dead.
On the 12th of April, Truman was urgently called to the White House. Roosevelt had chosen him 6 months earlier as his vice president only because he wanted a colorless, unobtrusive man who would not overshadow him. Roosevelt had just died of a brain hemorrhage. All of the presidential advisors were waiting for Truman in the Oval Office. Timidly he asked, "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" The answer came back in unison, "What can we do for you, Mr. President?" Roosevelt's sudden death thrust Truman into the spotlight for at least 4 years. He was over 60 and had never harbored ambitions for the presidency. He was known at the White House as the accidental president. Roosevelt had totally ignored his vice president, giving him no specific jobs and not letting him in on any state secrets. He never sought Truman's opinion and did not even brief him after returning from the Yalta Conference. Truman's role was to organize official dinner parties, welcome visitors, and generally shake hands. Nothing and nobody had prepared him for what lay in store. Roosevelt alone made all the decisions concerning US foreign policy. He was at one time head of state, head of the executive, head of foreign affairs, and commander-in-chief of the American Armed Forces. Truman decentralized presidential power. Within a few months, he established a new structure in which the Secretary of State held a central role. A new, vitally important post was created, Secretary of Defense, with offices at the Pentagon. Truman also founded the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. Finally, the cornerstone of the new structure, the NSC, the National Security Council, a veritable state within a state. Truman set up a system that was to remain in place until the present day. Harry Truman remained in power until January 1953. His successor, the conservative Dwight Eisenhower, continued the old school of politics by surrounding himself with aged and well-tried advisors. This stuffy image would be swept away by the birth of the Kennedy myth.
Do you want a man for president who's seasoned through and through, but not so doggone seasoned that he won't try something new? You cast your vote for Kennedy and...
At 43 years of age, John F. Kennedy was the youngest ever president-elect of the United States. The Oval Office would become the setting for confrontation between the heads of the different departments, sometimes involving the president himself. A nest of ambition where members vied to become the favorite. Kennedy gathered around him an exceptional team of intellectuals, political science professors, historians, economists, and journalists. They were known as the best and brightest. One of his first appointments was renowned Harvard history professor Arthur Schlesinger.
John Kennedy appointed me as one of his special assistants. And I said, yes, as a historian, it's a unique opportunity to see history in the making. But I'm not altogether clear what I will be doing as your special assistant. To which he replied, "I'm not altogether clear what I'll be doing as president."
For the first time, these advisors, who came to be known as the president's men, would be more influential than the elected members of government.
We were a young group, a fairly collegial group, unlike subsequent administrations, which had the snake pit aspect. We represented a new broom sweeping clean. Eisenhower, we thought, had given the impression of an old country run by old men. President Kennedy represented a new generation.
Theodore Sorensen became the president's personal foreign affairs advisor. He was to write Kennedy's speeches, coining the words and phrases that went to people's hearts. In Sorensen, Kennedy found his true voice.
My duties included not only advice and assistance on legislation and policy and substance, but in helping him articulate those words in speeches, writings, messages.
Sorensen was certainly the #1 speechwriter. It was Sorensen who put those best speeches together, and I think the ask not for what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, I think that was particularly Sorensen's.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
I have never claimed to be the author of John F. Kennedy's speeches. I was simply working to help him get there.
And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Ich bin ein Berliner. My wife and I were there at a dinner one night when he was practicing that. And he was very resentful of the fact that he didn't have a good accent.
Ben Bradlee, future editor-in-chief of the Washington Post, was a journalist at Newsweek. He soon became Kennedy's unofficial advisor and confidant.
Well, I was not an advisor to Kennedy. I was a sounding board, I think, as he tried ideas out on me, maybe. But I was not an advisor in any sense of the word.
Sometimes Kennedy deliberately told things to Ben Bradlee because he wanted to get them out.
If he wanted to tell me something that I could not use, he would just tell me that. You can't use this. And then tell me something. Often he also said, be sure you do use this.
The deputy director of the CIA, Richard Helms, realized many of Bradlee's articles were word-perfect versions of conversations that he himself had had with the president. Convinced that the Kennedy-Bradlee relationship posed a national security threat, he demanded that Newsweek transfer Bradlee far from the White House. But his demands went unheeded.
They were friends and so forth, and I assumed that maybe Bradlee learned a little bit more about some of these things. But after all, if Kennedy was prepared to talk to Bradlee, he was talking to a newspaper man, the chances are it would be in the press.
Well, that was Helms's problem and Kennedy's. It wasn't mine. I was a good patriot. I think Helms was nuts. He was cuckoo.
Eisenhower had appointed the president of General Motors as his Secretary of Defense, convinced that a man who could organize the tens of thousands of employees of the country's biggest company would make an ideal head of the U.S. military. The idea also appealed to Kennedy, and he asked his advisors, what's the second biggest company after General Motors? Ford, replied Ben Bradlee. Kennedy picked up the phone and invited Ford President Robert McNamara to join his team as Secretary of Defense.
In Washington, Senator Kennedy announces his choice for Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, who was recently named president of the Ford Motor Company and who gives out potential earnings of $3 million.
I accept my full duties with the Defense Department with a tremendous sense of challenge, with full confidence in the ability of President-elect Kennedy to lead this nation forward.
And then he insisted I be Secretary of Defense, and I said, well, no, I'm not qualified for that either. But if he will allow me to appoint the most outstanding people in the country without any regard to political affiliation, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, and with no interference from the White House, I would be the sole judge and appoint all of the senior people in defense from, I'll call it the best and the brightest, I would do it. He said yes, and he never violated that. It left me with a sense almost of fear, of concern. Fear is probably the wrong word, concern. And that's what I felt, a tremendous sense of responsibility. And a real question, was one capable of fulfilling it?
John Kennedy had the greatest respect and admiration for Bob McNamara. He liked the way his mind worked. He liked the way he articulated his positions.
Kennedy confided to Sorensen, "This morning I caught McNamara reading a book by Teilhard de Chardin. I think we've put an intellectual in charge of the Pentagon."
I don't know that I should be called an intellectual, but it is true that Kennedy said to me one day, "Bob, what are you reading?" And I said, "Well, I'm just reading Teilhard de Chardin. I'm very fond of his writings." He said, "My God, I never would have expected that of you. You really are an intellectual."
Kennedy appointed Senator for Texas Lyndon B. Johnson as his vice president. As a humble schoolteacher from an impoverished background, Johnson felt excluded from the snobbish, moneyed circle around Kennedy. Universities like Harvard and Yale seemed on another planet. Kennedy's choice had been a political maneuver. He needed the Texan vote to ensure his election. He won by the narrowest of margins over Nixon, just 100,000 votes out of 60 million.
Johnson himself was a man of such enormous energy, and the vice presidency is just a non-job. There's nothing anyone can do.
I think he was out a little bit. I mean, the vice president in this country, that is not a great office. He was suspicious of the Kennedy people. He thought, sort of, I think mistakenly, that Kennedy had great style, and that he was sort of envious of that style.
But he was an insecure man, and that insecurity was reflected in his feeling that he was being looked down upon by the Kennedy staff. We did not look down upon him. JFK and LBJ were perfectly friendly. They liked each other. Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson did not like each other. They had a kind of chemical dislike of each other.
Kennedy had made his brother Robert head of the Justice Department, but Bobby would quickly become the president's right-hand man. In his memoirs, Johnson wrote, "There's no point asking which advisor was most listened to. It wasn't McNamara, it wasn't Sorensen, it wasn't anybody, it was his brother, Bobby."
He was terribly close to Bobby. Bobby Kennedy was number one.
I think that members of the cabinet recognized that there was necessarily a closer relationship between the president and his brother than there could ever be between the president and any other member of the cabinet.
There are half a dozen or 4 or 5 special assistants with immediate access to the president. And then, of course, there was a support staff, secretarial staff, and so on.
Alexander Haig, future Commander-in-Chief of NATO and U.S. Secretary of State, was a military advisor at the Pentagon.
President Jack Kennedy was opposed to meetings, NSC staff, a formal presentation of papers and pros and cons and risks. He liked to do it very quickly, and he formed a government in which he put his people at every key junction box. And therefore, when he wanted the answer to a question, he got the answer he wanted to hear, because they would always give him that answer.
I remember being there for dinner one night when Sorensen and Bundy came in to talk to him about something, and after they left, Kennedy said, turned around and said to us, "You can't beat brains, really. You can't beat brains." And so I think they were extraordinarily close to him on an intellectual level.
He had a tremendous intellect and an intellectual curiosity. He wanted to know about everything. Look at himself. If appropriate, laugh at himself, rather than to become so pompous and so important with all of his power and prestige that sometimes he forgot what the real problem was.
There's some doubt whether they were really the brightest and the best. I mean, some of them, like McNamara, was extremely bright, but whether he was the best for that job, especially in Vietnam, I think is open to great doubt. But they were very, very smart, very had great brains.
We had, I think, the ablest group of executives in any cabinet office in the history of the Republic. Now, we made many mistakes, human beings do, but they were an extraordinarily able, dedicated group.
Kennedy's first major crisis was a legacy of former President Eisenhower. It was his administration that had decided on the Bay of Pigs operation. 1,200 Cuban expats, trained, armed, and financed by the CIA, were to land in Cuba in an attempt to overthrow Castro's communist regime. A year earlier, Castro had forced the dictator Batista to flee the country and had nationalized the American-owned sugar plantations, causing a break in diplomatic relations between the two countries and bringing Cuba closer to the Soviet Union. Kennedy endorsed the invasion plan masterminded by the CIA.
By the time Kennedy became president, the day before, Eisenhower and Kennedy had a meeting, which Eisenhower recommended that Kennedy move as fast as possible on what became the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy was very dubious about the whole thing.
President Kennedy inherited from the previous administration both the plans and the planners for a Cuban exile invasion of their homeland with support from the United States. President Kennedy kept it very close to the few people who were already involved. They assured him that it had every chance of success, and in any event, U.S. involvement would not be known. And both of those premises turned out to be wholly incorrect. By the time it became clear that the operation was not going to succeed and that the premises on which it had been sold to the president were false premises,
some of his advisors kept trimming what could have been a successful military operation and turned it into a farce. I was intimately involved with that, and I must say, it was a very poorly run show.
That would simply be regarded as a retreat on Kennedy's part by those in the intelligence and military communities who had been planning this operation. Politically, that would have been a difficult start for a new president who had won by the narrowest of margins, nor would it be good for the stature of the United States in the Cold War against the Soviet Union.
I will never leave this country. Cuba must not be abandoned to the communists, and we do not intend to abandon it either. Then I want it clearly understood that this government will not hesitate in meeting its primary obligations, which are to the security of our nation.
So Kennedy was trapped, and he was trapped. He really couldn't politically sustain his own judgment of the situation against that of the great general, so he decided to go ahead.
The invasion failed. A perfect failure ran the headlines of the New York Times. The newspaper had uncovered the imminent invasion, but the president had called on the chief editor's patriotism not to publish the news of the information. Kennedy later wrote to the editor saying, "It is a pity. The publication of your article would have forced us to call off the invasion and thus avoid the fiasco of the Bay of Pigs operation."
I wouldn't call the Bay of Pigs a poison gift. First place, it was a CIA program, not a Defense Department program. Second place, it was the Eisenhower administration that formulated the plan. But in the third place, it was the Kennedy administration that implemented it. We didn't have to, so we can't blame Eisenhower. It was a terrible mistake, a total failure. a perfect failure.
I don't like the description of a perfect failure. I don't know what the difference between a failure and a perfect failure. That's language. It was a failure.
Some months later, the president said to me, "Thank God for the Bay of Pigs. If we had not had that fiasco and learned that the experts are not always right, we'd be in Laos right now, up to our necks."
One valuable consequence of the Bay of Pigs was that Kennedy took the measure of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and never paid any attention to their advice and recommendations thereafter.
Kennedy took responsibility for the disaster, but called the director of the CIA, Richard Bissell, to the White House to inform him of his dismissal and of his replacement by his deputy, Richard Helms.
He's reputed to have said to Bissell that in the British system, I would have to go, but in our system here, you have to go.
In August 1962, an American spy plane took off for a routine reconnaissance flight over Cuba. It discovered massive amounts of military equipment and Soviet anti-aircraft missile installations on the island.
There was a constant stream of information from deserters, from people who fled Cuba, from agents inside Cuba, that the Russians were putting missiles. But the consensus was that these were missiles that were to protect Russian interests and Cuban interests, and that they were not offensive missiles aimed at the United States.
At that time, the CIA stated that we had photographs of the missiles, but they stated there were no nuclear warheads there.
On the 14th of October, a second reconnaissance flight revealed the presence of rocket launchers. Further detailed examination of the aerial photographs confirmed that the Soviets were installing surface-to-surface nuclear missiles trained on the United States.
The minute a U-2 airplane went over that end of the island, they came back with photographs of this launching area. How long would the president had to make up his mind before they were to shoot, and I think it was something like 3 days, something like that. But he made time for himself to use to see if he couldn't find a peaceful way out of this.
Nothing exemplifies that better than the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, when the president first learned that Soviet nuclear missiles capable of reaching all parts of the United States, as well as many other parts of the Western Hemisphere, had now been located on the island of Cuba. The first time in history that the Soviet Union had put nuclear missiles outside their own territory. Kennedy knew a new crisis was at hand.
The next day, John Kennedy called a press conference.
The Soviet Union and Cuba and the United States must all be aware that this will produce the greatest crisis which the world has faced in its history. We prepare for that. While hoping for the best, we expect the worst. It's very possible that the worst will come, and we should prepare for it. That's why we continue our daily surveillance. It's possible, conceivable.
That was a confrontation, a nuclear confrontation, and we could not simply accept it.
He was really scared. I mean, he feared that we were on the brink of World War III.
If we were not willing to respond to this kind of menace and deception 90 miles from our shore, why would they ever have any confidence in our responding to an attack thousands of miles from our shore on Western Europe?
Khrushchev took the gamble of planting nuclear missiles in Cuba because he thought Kennedy was weak.
It's very possible that Khrushchev may have thought that Kennedy not having shouted back at him or walked out on him meant that Kennedy was young and more interested in diplomacy than he was in standing up and fighting back. The fact of the matter is, if that was what he thought, he misjudged John Kennedy, and so later discovered.
From the film theater installed in the basement of the White House, Kennedy and his team of advisors kept abreast of the developing crisis. In Cuba, Castro ordered a general mobilization. America's failure to stop the construction of the Berlin Wall the previous year and the Bay of Pigs disaster encouraged the Soviets to make a bold move in Cuba.
Kennedy did not believe that the Russians would go to war. We had both local superiority in the Caribbean, and we had strategic superiority because we had many more missiles than they had. It would have been an act of suicide, Kennedy felt, for Khrushchev to make a decision to go to war. But his great concern was with something going wrong somewhere down the line.
We were aware of the fact that a nuclear war could erupt if there was a misstep by the United States, if there were an act of irresponsibility by a local Soviet commander, if the United States took too precipitous an action, causing a panic or overreaction on the part of the Soviets, there could be a nuclear war.
Remember the movie Dr. Strangelove, where a crazy general sets off? That's why Kennedy was very concerned about problems of what is called in Pentagonese command and control. And he wanted to make sure that for example, the whole process of stopping Russian ships, that this would be done in a non-provocative way.
During that time, we worked almost literally 24 hours a day, examining all alternatives. And Kennedy's approach to deciding on a course of action was a very wise approach, but it wasn't a crisis that was managed because neither Khrushchev nor Kennedy was able to control all of the variables. And we came that close to nuclear war. When I say we, I mean you. The world
Robert Kennedy was very effective in persuading some of the others originally in favor of an attack. He persuaded several people to change their line and support the blockade.
most of the time Bobby and I were on the same side of the argument. And I think what he was basically saying is that some of our colleagues who opposed us, quote, lost it, unquote, were irrational or unstable. I don't really think that was the problem. It was a very, very difficult situation with a lot of unknowns.
Robert Kennedy and Robert McNamara were also strong advocates of a blockade, of a quarantine, as an alternative to an invasion.
They all wanted to have the airstrike and the invasion, and the president said no.
John Kennedy was a man of reason. Robert Kennedy was a man of emotion.
It was clear the airstrike, far from being a surgical airstrike, would require multiple airstrikes all over the island, and the chaos ensuing would require a U.S. invasion with its own armed forces. And someone said, well, Mr. Secretary, if we do bomb Soviet missiles in Cuba, what will be the Soviets' response? He said, I know the Soviets very well. You bomb their missiles, their personnel on the territory of their ally, and they will feel compelled to respond in kind. Probably they will bomb NATO missiles in Turkey. And then what should we do, Mr. Secretary? Well, if under our NATO obligations, if they bomb NATO missiles in Turkey, we will be obligated to drop bombs on Soviet territory. And then what will the Soviets do if we drop nuclear bombs on their territory? Well, he said, by then we hope that things will cool down and people will talk. It's very cold in that room when we heard that conversation.
My God, what would have happened? Do you call that managing a crisis? No way. We managed it in the sense that we prevented knowledge seeping out before we had developed a plan, and we weren't subject to the tremendous pressure from uninformed individuals. We took time to think through alternatives. We took a week to even formulate a proposal, which ultimately became the quarantine.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
We had 180,000 troops mobilized and at ports in the southeastern United States with the ships available to move them to Cuba. And on the Thursday night, the Soviet commander in Cuba had sent a cable saying he was moving nuclear warheads closer to their delivery vehicles. Khrushchev scrawled, approved across it, and sent it back. People have said that the Cuban Missile Crisis was the best managed foreign policy crisis or defense policy crisis of the past half century. And in one sense, I think it was, but we were lucky. You can't manage nuclear crises, and it was a nuclear crisis.
At the end of November, Khrushchev capitulated and withdrew his missiles from Cuba. The Western world claimed victory. Kennedy had forced the Soviets to pull back, but the reality was slightly different. Kennedy had in fact accepted Soviet demands that in exchange for removing their missiles from Cuba, the US would dismantle their missile bases in Turkey, an immediate neighbor of the USSR.
An important part of the decision was to trade the Turkish, U.S. missiles in Turkey for the Cuban missiles, the Soviet missiles in Cuba. That was never made public until my book on Robert Kennedy, which came out in 1978. And so that element of the crisis was never disclosed.
30 years later, 30 years, that we learned how wrong we were. They had 162 nuclear warheads there, about 90 tactical warheads to be used against an invasion force of the kind we had.
In Havana 3 or 4 years ago, Bob McNamara and I were part of that meeting with Castro. And when also a Russian general was present, who had been a general in Cuba at the time of the missile crisis. When General Gribkov said that not only were the warheads there, but there were warheads not just for long-range missiles, but for tactical nuclear weapons, and that they had the delegated authority to use those in case of a U.S. invasion. Bob McNamara nearly fell out of his chair.
Aid to Vietnam by the U.S. has added up to $3 billion and 14,000 men who are called advisors, but who are in the thick of the battles against the Viet Cong Reds.
Kennedy had reinforced U.S. commitment to Vietnam. From 1961, he added direct military aid to the financial and material aid already in place. There were 600 American advisors in South Vietnam in 1961, 6,000 soldiers in 62, 17,000 in 63, 500 of whom had already been lost in action. Kennedy's policy drew the U.S. inexorably into the conflict. The Vietnam War had begun.
The people that he saw in the White House, I don't mean to put myself in any kind of similar importance, but he listened. He listened to the wives, and they said, you know, what the hell are you doing in Vietnam?
Everyone came back and said, enough with these instructors and advisors. You've got to now put full combat troop divisions into South Vietnam and fight this war. And you've got to bomb North Vietnam. And you've got to mine the harbors of Haiphong. And it's very interesting what it says about John F. Kennedy. He never said, no, that's crazy, that won't work. But he never said yes.
The change from advisors to soldiers took place mostly under Kennedy, sure.
He did not want to go into the 1964 election on the question, the issue of who lost Indochina.
I know what he had decided October 2nd, 1963, that we were going to plan to withdraw completely the 16,000 advisors within 2 years.
I don't know whether he was thinking about it or not, but he didn't do it. I mean, there's a contention among Kennedy's friends or supporters that if he had stayed on, he would have pulled the troops out and have changed the character of the war. There was absolutely no evidence of this. This was simply an opinion of certain of his friends to support him.
On November 22, 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas.
The Warren Commission was appointed by Lyndon Johnson after Kennedy's death. I think we now know that the Warren Commission inquiry was incomplete. We now know that both the CIA and the FBI withheld information from the Warren Commission, which would have been vital for any adequate investigation. I think they withheld them, however, not for conspiratorial reasons, but to hide their own bureaucratic incompetence.
Recently declassified documents reveal that from August 1962, Kennedy was single-mindedly intent on getting rid of Castro. He held several meetings with FBI and CIA chiefs to discuss the various possibilities. His brother, Bobby, was literally obsessed with Castro's assassination and pestered Director of Central Intelligence Richard Helms on a daily basis.
Bob Kennedy, on behalf of his brother, was very anxious to get something done about Castro and about the Castro regime in Cuba. And he was on the telephone constantly and at meetings and various other ways trying to promote more energy, more aggressiveness in this matter.
I'm sure, but it certainly was not at a level that he would have sought to have Castro killed. I do not believe that John F. Kennedy ever favored or much less authorized the assassination of Fidel Castro or any other leader.
I'm not sure that people were as conscious of it, of what a mistake it was. We learned later that on 7 or 8 occasions, the White House and Bobby Kennedy, in behalf of his brother, had launched assassination attempts against Castro.
We failed. All I can say is that Castro is still there.
In Alexander Haig's opinion, tired of the countless attempts on his life, Fidel Castro decided to take his revenge by ordering Kennedy's assassination in Dallas. Haig further believes that Lyndon Johnson deliberately buried the file.
President Johnson recognized that. And he was tormented. And he said to his advisors, if the American people ever believe Castro had anything to do with this, we'll be swept out of power. He was convinced Castro did it. And he went to his deathbed, convinced of that. So these things have to be known, and they're never told. But they will be in 20, 25 years, and that's good enough for me.
Kennedy's death raised similar questions to those following Roosevelt's. Would Johnson follow the same political line as his predecessor or come up with his own? Like Truman, he was replacing an extremely popular president who had named him vice president out of political necessity. And like Truman, he knew nothing of major international affairs. Unlike Kennedy, Johnson had no taste for foreign politics, preferring to take care of domestic issues, where there was still a great deal of work to be done. The Civil Rights Bill had only been passed 3 years earlier, giving the vote to all citizens, regardless of race or color.
I cannot bear this burden alone. I am here today to say I need your help. I need the help of all Americans.
Well, I think he had limited experience in foreign affairs, but he had far more competence than he's been given credit for. But he was the victim of circumstances. He replaced the president, assassinated in his term, before his term was out. He then had to pick up a fast-moving train, which was Vietnam, and he had advice from people in the State Department and in the White House that was counter to what I call sound strategic thinking. And he also lived with the aftermath of the Kennedy presidency.
He was very suspicious of all Kennedy's friends, all Kennedy's advisors. They thought that Johnson thought that the Kennedy advisors were more interested in Kennedy's image than in advising the new president. And with some outstanding exceptions, I think that was probably right.
I offered my resignation the next day. I got the typical Johnson treatment. That is, he said to me, "Oh, I need you far more than John Kennedy needed you," and so on. And so I reluctantly agreed to stay on for a transition period of a couple of months.
He was not a master of foreign affairs. And he thought by keeping on the Kennedy team that he was keeping Kennedy's policy. But there's a difference. Kennedy knew how to utilize the best in each of those people.
Johnson kept on Kennedy's men, Sorensen, Schlesinger, McNamara, and Robert Kennedy, but relations were strained, sometimes violent. Bobby Kennedy couldn't even bear to see Johnson sitting in his brother's chair. What had been a marriage of convenience between John Kennedy and Johnson was to end in acrimony.
President Johnson made his statement to me privately. I made two mistakes. He said, one is I kept the Kennedy advisors. I kept them. And I listened to them instead of listening to my own instincts. He was tormented by the fact that he didn't bring in a new team of new advisors instead of taking the advice from the same old people. The Harvard concept, whiz-kid concept of conflict management.
In November 1964, Johnson won a landslide election, making him President of the United States. After the interim, he now had to take up the heritage bequeathed him by Kennedy, the Vietnam War, a time bomb that could go off any day.
When Kennedy died, we were deeply involved in Vietnam militarily. Johnson, in a way, inherited President Kennedy's policies with respect to Vietnam. I think, in effect, he was a free agent. As the war evolved, he had the freedom to proceed as he believed best. Of course, he had some degree of legacy from Kennedy, but he went far beyond the legacy.
Being plunged into the Vietnamese situation by this almost accidentally becoming president was a real burden for him. And I think he had a very hard time adjusting to it and handling it.
Every American president has offered support to the people of South Vietnam. We have helped to build, and we have helped to defend. Thus, over many years, we have made a national pledge to help South Vietnam defend its independence. And I intend to keep that promise.
He did not want to be a president who had seen a defeat of American military forces. This had never happened in our history, and I think that he was bound and determined not to have it happen in this case.
He believed very strongly in the domino theory, as did we all. By the way, I think we were wrong on that. But we all believed that. President Kennedy did, President Johnson did, I did, the chiefs did, the Secretary of State did, and so on. That faced with this dilemma, if we withdraw or don't put in more troops, we lose East Asia and South Asia, the domino theory. But if we do put in more troops, we're going to lose it anyhow, and we're going to kill Americans.
In September 1964, after a more or less engineered incident in the Gulf of Tonkin, Johnson and McNamara obtained carte blanche from the US Congress in a climate of general indifference. From an expeditionary force of 20,000 men, the number rose to 500,000 in 1967. In 3 years, 3 million tons of bombs were dropped on North Vietnam. 800 tons a day, almost twice the amount used throughout the whole of World War II. Robert McFarlane, future director of the National Security Council, commanded one of the first units into Vietnam in 1964.
I commanded the first American unit that went into Vietnam, and 10 years later I was in the West Wing when we evacuated the last American, and very anguished history for me personally. But and I disagree with McNamara. I think his book is a gross distortion of reality. He lied. He lied again and again and again about at the beginning of that war. And he ought to take responsibility for it. It was just an outrageous performance.
I don't want to be critical of McNamara. I served him. I was his special assistant, a deputy special assistant for almost 2 years. He had many strengths, but one of them was not micromanaging military conflict. He knew nothing about it, as did any of the Harvard professors who came down as the so-called experts during that period. It was a disastrous period for America, and we made many, many profound misjudgments.
He should have told the president, look, I don't know the nature of this conflict. I cannot advise you on this. But he didn't. He lied about it. He said this will be easy. It's crazy.
We sent practically daily reports to the White House on what was happening in Vietnam, some of them favorable, some of them unfavorable. And if you looked them all over, I think the reporting of the agency was quite accurate as these situations developed. The bombing was not effective. Maybe later on it was effective.
He didn't know what to do. He had no idea what to do. And worse, he interfered in preventing the advice of people who did know quite a lot about revolutionary warfare from ever getting to the president. And then, of course, he lied about the facts. He lied about the Gulf of Tonkin in August of '64 and about the losses in the early days of the war. He went to the Congress and testified under oath with his hand on the Bible and lied about how much we were losing. He is very culpable, and he has taken the stance of being kind of an innocent person with nothing more than bad judgment. It's a lot worse than that. It was criminal. Criminal. 58,000 lives were lost, and millions of Vietnamese. Crazy.
As the Vietnam War intensified, Johnson took complete charge of military operations. Each morning, he personally decided on the strategy for ground action, pinpointing airstrike targets. The cost of the war rose to a staggering $35 billion, close to a third of the US budget.
We had 500,000 men. I was convinced you couldn't achieve the objective militarily. We went ahead pursuing a military course because we tried, quite unsuccessfully, to initiate negotiations. And I think there, with hindsight, we were very amateurish in the way we put forward the negotiating proposals, and they led nowhere.
When I got to the demilitarized zone and between North and South Vietnam, and McNamara had an idea that we would take chemicals, Agent Orange, and we would eliminate the jungle, just destroy, defoliate the jungle, all the way from the Gulf of Tonkin to Laos. And that this would be an easy thing to do, and then from then on you would just see the North Vietnamese walking in the open. I mean, just crazy. And everyone's told him, this is nuts, this will not work. But he ignored the advice of quite experienced officers and continued to lie to the Congress about how easy a victory this was going to be. We'll be home by Christmas, 50,000 more troops, it will be over. It was just an outrage.
I think Johnson was wrong on Vietnam. I think we were wrong on Vietnam. Vietnam was a serious mistake. Each of us made mistakes. Each of us misjudged the motives and capabilities of the other. We should try to draw lessons from what was certainly a failure. We, the U.S., clearly did not achieve our objectives in Vietnam. We failed.
If he acknowledges that and says, I'm sorry, I don't understand this, I'm going to resign, his future is over. And this moral cowardice, this flawed character of a weak person,
Nearly every day saw anti-war demonstrations outside the White House or the Pentagon. One of the leaders of the peace movement was Robert McNamara's own son.
Johnson and I had deep affection, real love for each other, and great respect for each other. But we were totally at odds on Vietnam. And I couldn't persuade him I was right, and he couldn't persuade me he was right.
In February 1968, Robert McNamara left the White House.
I'm not sure I resigned. I'm not so sure. 30 years after I left the Defense Department, I don't know whether I quit or was fired.
Johnson, completely isolated and cut off from reality, no longer trusted anyone. He spent his days listening to audio tapes describing the dramatic situation in the field sent from the front line by his son-in-law, the only person Johnson was convinced not hiding the truth from him. As the election approached, Robert Kennedy, who believed himself to be a better candidate to run against Nixon, decided to campaign for the U.S. presidency against Johnson.
Johnson thought that Bobby was too ambitious and too, and he had reason to feel that. Bobby Kennedy wanted to be president.
Became a leading opponent of the Vietnam War. Largely for that reason, decided to oppose President Johnson for the presidential nomination in 1968, and was in the midst of a campaign that I believe would have carried him to the presidency when he too tragically was gunned down.
On the very evening of his victory in the California primary, Robert F. Kennedy was shot, 5 years after his brother John. On March 31, 1968, Lyndon B. Johnson announced his decision to stop the bombing of North Vietnam. He also announced he would not be running for re-election. His departure from the political scene, along with Bobby Kennedy's death, opened the doors of the White House to Richard Nixon, the eternal loser. Johnson returned to live on his ranch in Texas, where he died 5 years later, on the day after the signing of the Paris peace agreements which ended the war in Vietnam.